Joining us now to talk about whether or not we are actually ready to bomb Syria, whether or not we should bomb Syria, and what has to happen before that could be done, and how it would be done most effectively, is a man who I haven't had the pleasure of speaking to for a couple of years now. Used to speak to him with a lot more frequency, and he was the commander of the USS Cole, which of course was attacked by Al-Qaeda back when Bill Clinton was the President of the United States. And we welcome in Commander Kirk Lippold, USN, retired. Commander, great to speak with you, sir.
Steve, great to be back on the show. Thank you for having me today.
Well, it's my pleasure. Of course, I also want to point out to folks that you've written a book which came out last year, Front Burner, Al-Qaeda's Attack on the USS Cole, which is such a riveting story and such a riveting account of what happened. I recommend it highly. But let's focus first on Syria. You heard the president. You had said earlier in the week, I believe, that we may not be ready to strike Syria. That was a few days ago. There's no indication that any strike is imminent. So where are we right now in your view, and are we ready to strike Syria?
Right now, it is my belief that we are ready to strike Syria, but there is a lot of groundwork that needs to be laid, and there are a number of factors growing by the hour that should really make the United States and this president take pause as to whether we should get involved in this conflict at this point in time. I don't believe we should.
Okay. So that's something new on your part. Tell me what has happened in the last day or so to lead you to that conclusion, sir.
Well, for a start, we do not have authority under international law to conduct this strike. I know that the lawyers for both the British and for the United States are working very hard to say that based on humanitarian grounds, we should be able to strike because of the use of chemical weapons. But even if you listen, I mean, the president is very good at the use of words. He says, I believe that the Syrian rebels do not possess the capability to possess these arms. I believe that the Syrian rebels do not have the wherewithal to actually fire them. But he didn't say that with absolute certainty. And until we know for sure that, A, the Assad regime has used them, that they used them with complicity, because let's face it, the Russians are not going to let the Syrians use those kinds of weapons, given that they gave them to them, unless they had some control over how and when they're going to be used. Assad is not stupid in how he remains in power.
Right, and it's interesting, getting back to the evidence, and I think the evidence is a key here, because, right from the get-go, it was as if this administration determined that it was the Assad regime that used these chemical weapons. Now, I've talked to experts. I've talked to General Paul Vallely and others who said that the rebels simply don't have the capability to deliver those chemical weapons, and certainly not the way they were delivered. Having said that, today you have a story in the New York Times that says there's no smoking gun in the evidence that shows it was Assad. You have the Associated Press, and I bring these out because they're, certainly in the tank for Obama normally. Associated Press says intelligence on the weapons, no slam dunk. And you have politicians both here and in Britain, Great Britain, trying to slow this down. And interestingly enough, it appears that France, which was very outspoken at the beginning, now trying to walk back, and they're saying that negotiations are really the only way to solve the overall crisis. So it appears that folks are backtracking. What would happen, though, Commander, if after all this, all the statements that the president and the administration and Joe Biden and everyone has made in the last few days, what happens if we don't take military action? Have we backed ourselves into that corner, regardless as to whether or not we have real 100% proof that it was Assad and not the rebels?
Absolutely not. Sometimes it takes the maturity of a leader to be able to walk back from the brink when you're up to it. Clearly, we have 5 destroyers positioned in the Eastern Mediterranean ready to go, but we need to think through some of the second and third order effects. Right now, the Russians are moving military forces and ships into the region. They are sending a clear signal that they are going to engage in this. And while Putin has said, quote, there will be catastrophic consequences, I think that what they're trying to say is we have a national interest in safeguarding an ally of ours in this region, and we better make darn sure that what we're about to engage in is not going to pull the Russians into this, is not going to give the excuse to Hezbollah to now start a war with Israel in hopes that it will draw into a larger regional conflict, because Iran is itching for the excuse to do that, especially if they can pull it off without having to go nuclear, which they are still working to do. And this afternoon, the Russians and the Chinese were working to get a immediate Security Council meeting to discuss the issue, and I honestly believe Putin and his representative at the UN are going to lay the marker on the line and say, if you engage militarily, we're going to defend our ally. So we better be prepared to not only just lob a few tomahawks, but also to defend our forces as well.
And here's the thing, and I think you addressed this earlier in the week when you said we weren't ready. If the purpose is to just send a message and not regime change, which obviously, according to everything the president has said, would be the purpose, then you have to weigh the repercussions, as you've just so eloquently pointed out. You have to weigh what the Russians might do, what the Chinese might do, what Iran might do, or you know, through Hezbollah or other means to Israel, and how it might affect them. I mean, is it all worth sending a message and lobbing in a few cruise missiles?
Well, I think what you have to look at is the timing of this working out to be more politically motivated than actually militarily required.
How so?
If there were a great humanitarian tragedy, the United States failed to engage in Rwanda. Why, when everybody worried about Iraq, Saddam Hussein had killed almost 15,000 of his own people with chemical weapons, there was no outrage. Suddenly, you have several hundred people killed by chemical weapons with Assad, and we want to start shooting. I know that with all due respect to Senator McCain, he's been itching for this fight for a long time. But surely I think there is time to gather more evidence. There is time to position more forces in the region. And if, in fact, we are going to strike, the president owes it to the American people and the world to share that evidence with us so that we can go into this another Middle East conflict with our eyes wide open, and we need to know, what are the objectives? What is going to be the end game? Who is going to replace the Assad regime? Because you can't just shoot a few missiles in there to send a signal without weakening him to a point that the rebels aren't going to take advantage of it. And oh, by the way, who are the rebels? Al-Qaeda, Muslim Brotherhood, they're the two primary ones. So I think that we need to think through this potential conflict very, very carefully. And while we are very close at the brink right now, there is nothing pressing us in the immediate that requires action in the next few days. We have time to allow other things to work before we begin the shooting war.
We're talking to Commander Kirk Lippold. He was the commander of the USS Cole here on the Steve Malzberg Show. You bring up other groups, sir, and there's a story out yesterday that U.S. intelligence agencies uncovered new evidence that Ansar al-Sharia, the al-Qaeda-affiliated militia that we believe orchestrated the 9/11 attacks against our compound in Benghazi last year, are training foreign jihadis to go fight with the Syrian rebels. So you're so right. I mean, we don't know, or we do know, who some of these rebels are, and I don't think most of America would find it too appetizing that we would be bombing anybody on behalf of these terrorists who despise the United States as much as they despise al-Assad.
I think you're absolutely right. And, I think that we also need to look at the fact that Russia, while backing the Assad regime, is not giving it so much horsepower that can absolutely go out and crush some of these rebels that have seized huge amounts of territories within the country.
Okay, now let me ask you about so I'm glad you are where you are, and it's interesting to hear your latest take on this. When you look back, and I know you're like I said, your book is a year old, and you're not on for the book, but I'm bringing it up by choice because I did read it. But when you and I have talked, you and I talked several years ago, and we gauged where we were in the war on terror. We talked about the failures that led to the USS Cole attack that allowed it to happen, the rules of engagement, ordering your guns to face the other way so that you couldn't protect yourselves, etc. Where do you think we've headed in the last 3 years, let's say, since we've last spoken? Maybe are things getting better, or are things getting worse?
I think overall we're making progress in the war, but we are having to make tremendous sacrifices for the long-term national security of the country that do not need to be there. I'll give you a clear example. The president's continuing desire to close Guantanamo Bay is beginning to cost us in our ability to protect ourselves. When we shut down in Iraq and when we were closing down in Afghanistan, we had to release prisoners back to the Iraqis that had been engaged in the killing of Americans because the president refused to bring them to Guantanamo Bay. And when you start having people getting killed and you cannot hold them accountable, and you don't have a place where we can bring some of these terrorists so we can learn how they recruit, train, equip, finance, and conduct operations, terrorist operations against our folks, then you're bound to lose the war. The drone program, while effective on the face at killing some of these high-level al-Qaedas, it's a morally lazy way to fight a war because every high-level guy you kill is a high-level guy who no longer can give you intelligence if we had gone out and captured him.
And by the way, as you may or may not be aware, it was announced today that the U.S. military released or transferred to Algeria two detainees from Gitmo, now to Algeria. So, and our government thanked them for helping us in our quest to close Guantanamo Bay.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's a political maneuver. These guys still represent a threat to the United States. There was still a certain degree of intelligence we felt these individuals possessed that we were willing to live without. So what is happening is, in the quest to close Guantanamo Bay, we are once again decreasing our ability to fight a war long term. And I think that President George W. Bush was correct. This fight in the global war on terror is not going to be over quick, and it is going to last years, if not decades. America is tired of fighting the war, but if you're going to get into a fight, you fight it effectively. Closing Guantanamo is not the way to do it, and picking another fight based on another country's national security issues is not ours. It has yet to be defined to me how our engagement in Syria, other than the fact that he used chemical weapons, is in our national security interests and makes the American people safer.
Commander, a pleasure to reconnect with you. I hope you'll come back, sir.
Absolutely, Steve. Great to be on the show again, and thanks again. Appreciate the touch about the book. It truly documents the heroes I was privileged to serve with.
And I'm sure folks could get it on Amazon and all over and anywhere they want it, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. Front Burner, Al-Qaeda's attack on the USS Cole by our guest, Commander Kirk Lippold. Thank you, Commander. Speak to you soon.
You as well, Steve. Thank you.
Bye-bye. All right. What a great man. And that story, folks, is such an American tragedy. How political correctness led to those deaths on the USS Cole, how political correctness allowed Al-Qaeda to do what it did. And, you know, I don't think we've seen the last of political correctness, unfortunately. 855-777-9660, Steve Malzberg on the Steve Malzberg Show on Newsmax TV.